Joe Coughlin, and I am the CEO and founder of Corporate Risk Solutions, which is an independent risk advisory firm located here in New York City. Over the past few months, I've had a chance to reach out to some really great contacts and relationships that we've had a chance to build up over the last many years. And one of those is a guy that I'm about to introduce to you by the name of Norman Anderson. Norm is the president and CEO of CGLA, located down in Washington, D.C. And Norm is extremely involved in infrastructure. He's got a fascinating background. And I think if you were to look at the definition of altruistic and then compare it to Norm, you would see why. Starting with his background in the Peace Corps, starting back in 1979 for 5 years down in Paraguay. But Norm today is involved with infrastructure projects around the world. And there are very few topics that I think I come in actually hot on. Normally I come in talking about something, any particular industry, and very excited, almost animated. But I think when I think of infrastructure, I kind of get mad. I get mad at the fact of the inertia that exists in the industry. Just let me give you a few facts before I introduce Norm. And well, let me introduce Norm. How are you there in Washington today? Looks like it's going to be
Morning. It's a beautiful day today here in Washington, D.C. Demonstrations are over. We're good to go. We're getting back in business.
Well, fascinating. Glad you could make it. So I just want to start off with a few different facts here. For the United States alone, most electronic power lines were built in the 50s and 60s, which had a 50-year lifespan. There's some 640,000 miles of high voltage power lines that are at full capacity. There's some $90 billion of backlog for just the rehab of our infrastructure on an annualized basis. According to TRIP, which is Transportation Revenue Investment Plan, we have $120.5 billion that is involved with extra vehicle repairs on an annual basis, which comes out to some $533 per driver. And I'm not even going to touch on airports and subways and some of the other things. But Norm, let me just start here. You've got a fantastic pedigree, graduate degrees from Harvard, and a frequent commentator on Fox and CNBC and Squawk Box and what have you. Does the United States need a stimulus plan?
Well, the United States needs a stimulus plan in infrastructure more than ever. This is a big deal right now. If you look at what's happened, obviously the bottom's fallen out of the economy. So on an annualized basis, we're going to be down 35 to 40%, 40 million unemployed. The answer, do we need a stimulus plan? Of course we need a stimulus plan. The trick is, in terms of an infrastructure stimulus plan, get it sized right. It has to be fast, right? Because it's going to take a while for us to spin up the economy again. We spun it down pretty dramatically. And the other thing that we've got to do is we've got to pick good projects, right? And then we've got to figure out what we're really interested in investing in. Is it operations and maintenance? So is it old projects from the past? Do we want to do highways, bridges, and tunnels? Or do we want to do projects that have to do with technology, projects that are really going to take us into the future? And the other thing that's happened recently is we're talking about bringing supply chains back from China to the US and to the Americas. Huge amount of infrastructure would be involved there, and a really interesting conversation for everybody in our country about what we're really talking about in terms of an infrastructure stimulus. The size issue, it's at least $2.5 trillion over 10 years. We actually think it needs to be much larger, but the key is that it's got to come from the private sector. It really can't be more taxes and more debt. It has to be more creative in terms of how we think about our future, how we plan for our future, and how we create the future for our children and grandchildren.
So let's talk about the stimulus side. It would seem that the pandemic, the coronavirus, has just scuttled, perhaps once again, that real need for that stimulus to come into infrastructure. Do you agree, or is there any chance that further monies get out by the end of the year and dedicated?
Well, I think the way to think about it is that there's a tremendous amount of stimulus money that's already been directed into the economy. And there's an opportunity. Just yesterday, the Fed announced that their $500 billion MLF program, they expanded where that's the eligibility for that to infrastructure agencies and infrastructure projects. So there's a real, at some level, there's an opportunity for the Fed, the government, Washington to take credit for a pretty dramatic infrastructure stimulus if we can get it shaped in the right direction. So I think that that's one of the things you want to keep in mind. The other thing you want to keep in mind, of course, the House approved yesterday a $489 billion, I believe, surface transportation bill, probably DOA in the Senate, but they're going to do something in terms of infrastructure. The thing that bothers me, Joe, is that you've really got to think about infrastructure as the future. And these guys are thinking about infrastructure as the past. So there's a really interesting project. You mentioned transmission lines. Anbaric has wind off of the east coast of the US from Maine all the way to Virginia. And they have a plan to build transmission from their wind farms off the coast all throughout the East Coast, right? What would that do? That would be modern. That would bring resilience to the East Coast in case something happened to our old transmission system. And they're doing that using pension fund money from Canadian pension funds. It's not your money, it's not my money, it's the Canadians' money. It looks like it's a pretty good deal. That's how we need to think about our infrastructure. So where's the money going to come from? Who's going to be the owners? And what do we really want to see in the future, right? Because this idea that what we really want to see in the future is what we saw in the past, that's driving with you watching the rear view mirror. It makes no sense at all. Huge opportunity for us to create a future.
So when I was preparing some remarks for this this interview, I was thinking it's like Sisyphus, right? You're rolling this boulder up the hill, and the only reprieve you get is when you get to the top, it rolls back down, and now you're following it back down. So it's just incredibly frustrating. And based on what I've read, that's out there in the public domain, a lot of these projects just never get off the ground because, one, the financial resources to do it, two is the political motivation to do it and stick with it, and then the third is corruption. I just want to segue that into the fact that in China, I believe like in the last 5 years, they've built some 17,000 miles of high-speed rail. And we're talking about in the last 20 years, we haven't built 1 mile of high-speed rail that is effective and is usable. So, I mean, I know that we have different societies. We're not communistic, and you can't put a gun to somebody's head and tell them you're going to take their land. But can you comment a little bit about any of that?
Well, yeah, no, I wrote an article earlier this week for Forbes, and I talked a little bit about heroic leadership, right? And one of the things is we've been talking about an infrastructure initiative since 1993 when the Clinton administration started, and every administration since then has come into office talking about doing infrastructure and hasn't done it. And one of the things that I think you have to look at, there's a couple of big issues, but one of them, where does the leadership come from? Well, the leadership comes from people like you and me, right? It's not actually going to come from Washington. We have to tell people what we want, and then we have to go out and start to organize around getting those projects up and running, because infrastructure tends to be a local business. We think about it as a national business, right? But when you do polling and you ask people, what does infrastructure investment mean to you? People say mobility and they say health. So they say the kinds of things, and they say jobs, right? So they say the kinds of things that impact on your personal experience. And I think that's one of the things that we have to understand. A second point is that in 1980, just to give you an example, about 70% of infrastructure investment came from federal government transfers, 30% from states and municipalities. Now it's about 80% from states and municipalities, only 20% from the federal government. And so the federal government has this giant role in terms of rules and regulations, but it doesn't have the balancing role of actually providing funding anymore, right? That's the kind of thing that we have to change. And again, the drum I beat is that we have in this country $27 trillion in terms of pension fund money, ready to go into infrastructure projects, right? 10% of that, and then you gear that up. You could easily get done what we need to get done if you had a much more agile bureaucracy. And trust me, the bureaucrats would love to actually move faster. There's no reason in their minds why they need to take 9.5 years to get a highway approved on average, except for they don't want to get sued. So we really do have to restructure our institutions. We have to recognize that we're no longer going to be taxing, using the gasoline tax to build our infrastructure. So the bureaucrats don't actually own our assets. We own our assets, and we can figure out how to bring in additional funding to make projects happen. And that's the kind of thing that we need to start doing more and more of.
Right. So Norm, we're running out of time, and we should be doing another 5 or 6 segments on this, and maybe we will if you will. But I just wanted to ask one last question. Where do you see space into the future as a part of infrastructure? We saw last Saturday, SpaceX, in a public-private partnership with NASA, launched its first manned missions, two astronauts up to the space station. So where do you see space? And then we'll conclude with that for now.
Well, look, I mean, I grew up on military bases, and, I grew up just like you probably did, watching the Mercury astronauts. Actually, John Glenn would visit our house. He worked with my dad. Big space fan, but what's happening now with space is actually fascinating. We work with a company called Thea, and Thea has an interesting technology where they would actually, what they do in terms of the level of granularity with which they take photographs, produce data about the Earth, and even looking at minerals below the Earth, et cetera. They have a technology that would be really interesting innovation in terms of getting the U.S. economy up and running, but also the kind of innovation that would help the global economy recover in terms of post-COVID opportunities. I mean, the point about space, I think, which is really interesting from my point of view, and using an example like Thea, is that space gives us a whole new way to think about who we are and what we do, how we take care of the planet, how we create opportunities for people around the world. So it's a whole different conceptual framework. Fascinating, the opportunities that we have, and fascinating the fact that we have to figure out how to take care of the future. We have to figure out how to take care of the next couple of generations. We have to figure out how to take care of where we live.
Norm, thank you very much. This has been great. I think we're going to have to do another segment at least, but we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
Me too.